I woke up to the sound of a harp. Not a ringtone, not a neighbor playing music, but a real, live harp being plucked with gusto outside my window at 7 in the morning. At first, I thought I was dreaming. Maybe it was some leftover audio hallucination from my late-night pizza binge and reruns of home makeover shows. But then came the unmistakable sound of a gas generator rumbling, followed by laughter, voices shouting floral instructions, and, was that a man in a tuxedo walking across my koi pond bridge? I threw open the curtains and stared in disbelief. My backyard had been transformed into a full-scale wedding venue overnight. White folding chairs lined up in perfect rows, an arch of roses and twinkling fairy lights framed the edge of my deck, and a catering truck had backed up into my driveway like it owned the place. What the hell was going on? I stumbled outside in my slippers and pajama shirt, brushing crumbs off my chest, and was nearly clipped by a woman pushing a 3-tiered wedding cake on a rolling cart. She looked up at me as if I were the intruder. "Excuse me," I said firmly. "What is happening here?" She replied with a half-smile, "Oh, are you the groundskeeper, honey? Can you help me find the fuse box? Your outlets aren't working." I stood there stunned as another man walked by holding a clipboard and shouting about aisle decorations. Someone screamed for the harpist to tune her strings, and a teenage girl was flying a drone overhead, capturing what I assumed was a rehearsal video. It was like I had been dropped into a wedding magazine by mistake. But this was my backyard, my house, my property, and I had no idea who any of these people were. I stormed through the crowd, pushing past flower arrangements and dodging confused guests, until I spotted a banner taped to my garage. "Congratulations, Chase and Amber," in gold calligraphy. Who the hell were Chase and Amber, and more importantly, why were they getting married at my place like it was some resort? I charged admission, for I yanked the banner down and marched straight over to the HOA office across the street, livid. The wedding wasn't just happening near me or next door. It was happening on my lawn, on my land, without a single phone call, text, or even a knock on the door. Inside the HOA office, the air smelled like stale printer ink and overbrewed coffee. Behind the desk sat Karen Whitmore, the HOA president and local queen of fake pleasantries. She glanced up from her spreadsheet, eyebrows raised in theatrical surprise. "Mason," she chirped, "oh, good morning. We were wondering when you'd join us." "Join you?" I snapped. "You mean the full-blown wedding happening on my backyard, which I didn't authorize?" She had the audacity to wave a printed sheet of paper at me like it was a divine decree. "It says right here we've designated your property as event-use communal space for the day. Isn't that just darling?" My jaw dropped. "You don't have the right to do that. I own that land. Separate from HOA jurisdiction. I have the deeds, the tax receipts, everything." She sighed in that condescending tone only people who've never worked a real job can master. "Well, we voted and decided it's in the community's best interest to host the event there. Plus the bride's family donated a rather generous check to the HOA, so we thought we'd extend a little hospitality." I stared at her like she'd grown 2 heads. A bribe. She just admitted to taking a bribe for access to my private yard, without so much as asking me first. "And the police," I demanded. "You do realize this is illegal trespassing?" She tilted her head. "Oh, we cleared it with Officer Dean. He said as long as there's no physical damage we're fine." I knew Officer Dean. Lazy. Half-retired. And a known golf buddy of Karen's husband. Fantastic. I left that office with steam pouring from my ears and made it halfway back home before I was nearly run over by a white stretch limo pulling into my driveway. Out stepped a man in a rhinestone blazer, aviators, and enough hair gel to classify as a fire hazard. Chase, I presumed. He sauntered up to me and gave me a once-over that could curdle milk. "You the gardener?" he asked casually. "My bride wants the pond cleared for her entrance. Gotta be clean for the helicopter footage." I blinked. "You're planning to fly a helicopter into my koi pond?" His face lit up as if I had just complimented his ego. "Oh, not into it, just over it, you know, dramatic effect. Plus Karen promised us full property rights for the weekend." I clenched my fist. "You have no rights here." He laughed and threw an arm around my shoulder like we were old pals. Relax, man, you'll still get a slice of cake. I went back inside and locked the door behind me before I broke something. Every fiber in my body wanted to scream. This wasn't just ignorance or entitlement. This was theft. Arrogant, organized theft parading as a neighborhood event. I poured myself a cup of coffee with shaking hands and stared out the window as they began testing the sound system. I could already picture the speech Karen would give. How this was all in the name of unity. How I was being difficult. How I should be honored they picked my place. But I didn't feel honored. I felt invaded, disrespected, humiliated. I opened my filing cabinet and pulled out every document I had. Title deed, boundary survey, HOA exemption clause, and I snapped a photo of each one. If they wanted to play dirty, they picked the wrong guy. Before I sold this house and went back to private contracting, I spent 10 years in structural engineering. My garage wasn't just for tools. It was a prep site for precision demo work. I'd helped build and tear down stadiums, malls, even part of an airbase. And right now I was looking at my backyard like a man staring at a chessboard. They had made their move. Now it was my turn. I picked up my phone and made 3 calls. One to Jake, my old explosives guy turned fireworks consultant. One to Denise, who handled concrete rigging and operated a jackhammer like a paintbrush. And one to Lenny, who owned a moving company with a backhoe and a short temper. I asked them all the same thing. How fast can you get here? They each answered the same way. Faster if I bring donuts. As I walked back outside, the sun was shining, the chairs were perfectly aligned, and a string quartet had taken the harpist's place. The wedding of Chase and Amber was in full swing. But they didn't know I was done playing defense. They didn't know that beneath those chairs lay a property line with legal teeth and permits waiting to be filed. They didn't know that tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. sharp my backyard wouldn't just be the site of a wedding. It would be a construction zone. A legally sanctioned renovation site complete with concrete dust jackhammers and friendly demolition experts wearing hard hats and grins. I wasn't going to stop their wedding. I was going to remodel it. The next morning started with the soothing sound of a bulldozer reversing into my driveway. The beeping was like music to my ears. The neighbors peered from their curtains, eyebrows raised, clutching their mugs in disbelief. Chase's wedding coordinator, a woman named Tessa with a clipboard and a headset, came sprinting toward the machine like a hen spotting a fox near her nest. She waved frantically, screaming at the driver to stop. But Lenny, perched comfortably in the cab of his beloved backhoe, simply pulled off his sunglasses, looked down at her, and said in the flattest voice imaginable, "Check the permits." Then he lowered the bucket right onto the dance floor tiles they'd just finished laying down. Tessa turned to me, flustered and red-faced, demanding to know what was going on. I calmly handed her a laminated document. "Emergency ground reinforcement inspection for soil instability," I said. "County approved and effective immediately." She stared at the paper like it was written in Greek, and then ran off yelling into her headset. I could hear her yelling something about Karen, who, to my satisfaction, was nowhere to be found. Probably still asleep, thinking she had outwitted me. Poor woman. She really didn't understand how deep she had waded into the wrong backyard. Denise pulled up next in a rented flatbed with hazard tape wrapped around the bumpers and a massive concrete saw strapped to the back like a trophy. She stepped out in steel-toe boots and a tank top that said "Demo is my cardio." I handed her a coffee. She grinned and sipped it, then asked which part of the patio I wanted gone first. I pointed to the white altar at the far end of the yard. "Let's start with their forever spot." She cracked her neck and fired up the saw. Sparks flew as the blade bit into the concrete, and the sound echoed like thunder across the neighborhood. Meanwhile, Jake arrived with 2 massive storage crates labeled FX Materials and opened them to reveal gear that looked like it belonged in a summer blockbuster. Fog machines, timed smoke bombs, portable strobe lights, and even a set of prop explosives rigged to puff colored chalk into the air. Technically all stage props, legally non-explosive, but psychologically devastating to anyone expecting a quiet ceremony. "You want dramatic entrance or grand finale?" he asked. I replied both. He nodded solemnly. "That's the spirit." As all this unfolded, Chase and Amber pulled up in their second limousine. I knew it was their second because I'd seen the first one blocked in by the county inspection van parked outside. Chase stepped out, looked at the scene, and let out a baffled shriek. "What the hell is this?" he stormed toward me, pointing at Lenny's backhoe, which was now scooping up flower arrangements and setting them gently into a debris bin. "You're ruining my wedding," he yelled like a teenager who just found out his Instagram was deleted. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Actually, I'm improving my property. And since it's mine, and not yours, that's entirely legal." Amber came trailing behind, her bridal gown hiked up as she tried to avoid the wet concrete patches. She looked horrified, which was ironic given how much horror they had unleashed on me. She tried the sympathy angle. "This is my special day," she pleaded. "Please, just delay the work until the afternoon." I raised a brow. "Did you delay asking me before inviting 200 strangers to my yard?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again, realizing she had no leg to stand on. Karen finally arrived just in time to catch one of Jake's chalk bombs go off behind the gazebo, sending a puff of blue dust into the sky. She came marching through the side gate in full meltdown mode, pointing fingers and demanding answers. She shouted at Denise to stop cutting, ordered Lenny to move his equipment, and tried to physically grab Jake's fog machine. Big mistake. Jake handed her a hard copy of the permits and politely informed her that any interference would be reported to the county. Karen flipped through the papers and immediately tried to call Officer Dean again. But I was ahead of her. I had already spoken to a different officer that morning and emailed over the footage Denise's drone had captured earlier in the week. Karen's own voice on camera bragging about using my property without my consent. That was enough to make any cop think twice before getting involved in her HOA schemes. Within an hour, my property had transformed into a full-fledged work zone. Orange cones marked off areas marked as unstable. Warning signs were placed every few feet. A few wedding guests arrived early and were greeted not with champagne, but with the smell of diesel and the whine of power tools. One lady in heels tried to walk across the yard and slipped in a patch of churned-up grass, landing face-first into a pile of disassembled centerpieces. Her screams were drowned out by the arrival of the delivery truck that dropped off a fresh pile of gravel right on top of what had been the dance floor. Inside my house, I monitored everything through my home security system. I had every camera rolling, every mic recording, and a backup of each clip being uploaded in real time. I wasn't just defending my property, I was documenting their downfall. The HOA had never faced resistance like this. They were used to passive neighbors and silent victims. But I was neither. And they were learning that in real time. Karen came knocking, furious, holding a community charter that she insisted gave her jurisdiction. I calmly pointed out that the page she referenced had been nullified by a later amendment, one I had personally co-signed with the county. She refused to believe it until I showed her the digital time-stamped PDF on my tablet. She tried to snatch it out of my hand. I pulled it back and said, "Karen, I suggest you go back to your office before you add assault to your list of problems." She hissed at me and stormed off. Meanwhile, Chase was desperately trying to livestream the ceremony, walking around with a selfie stick and trying to rally his influencer friends. But the footage was unusable. Every few seconds, a jackhammer drowned out the vows, or a forklift rolled through the background. In one scene, Lenny waved to the camera from inside the backhoe with a sign that read, "Congrats Amber and Chase, now please leave." Viewers in the comments tore them apart, calling them freeloaders and spoiled brats. It was glorious. Tessa eventually came back and said they were considering moving the ceremony to a nearby park. I nodded sympathetically and handed her the business card of a friend who ran a petting zoo that hosted goat-themed birthday parties. She looked at it in horror. I smiled and said, "They're very clean goats." By noon, the yard was unrecognizable. The altar was gone, the chairs had been replaced with soil markers, and the once smooth lawn now looked like a war zone of fresh dirt and warning flags. I stood at the edge of it all, sipping my second coffee of the day, as Jake set up the final smoke puff effect for the symbolic end of their event. With a countdown over the walkie-talkies, he triggered the device. Blue chalk blasted upward, coating the sky in a cloud that slowly drifted over the last arriving guest. And as they stood there coughing and shouting, I turned around, walked back inside, and shut the door behind me. I had delivered a clear message. You want to invade my land, expect consequences. The wedding wasn't cancelled. It was restructured. And I was just getting started. It was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives, but by 8 in the morning, the wedding site looked more like a battlefield than a place to exchange vows. The white aisle runner had been torn up and replaced with plywood sheets covering recently dug soil samples. The floral centerpieces were crammed into the dumpster with the remnants of the makeshift red carpet. The harpist had given up and left after being asked, twice, not to set up next to the concrete saw. And the guests who had arrived early were now sitting awkwardly in folding chairs lined up in the driveway, fanning themselves and trying to pretend the smell of gasoline wasn't lingering in the air like a warning sign. Inside, I watched everything from my kitchen window, sipping coffee like it was front-row theater. Jake had brought along a few more visual effects, smoke bursts shaped like hearts that were now being used, ironically, to announce the beginning of a fresh excavation trench. Denise had switched into her formal demolition boots, and Lenny was dragging a bundle of caution tape across the lawn while singing an off-key version of Here Comes the Bride. Chase was losing it, drenched in sweat, pacing in circles, and still wearing that ridiculous rhinestone blazer from the day before. He'd tried to get a local news crew to show up and film what he was calling the sabotage of the century, but the moment he mentioned that he didn't actually rent or own the property, the interest dried up fast. The producer asked him on camera if he had written permission from the homeowner. Chase went silent, his influencer smile twitching just a little. That clip was already starting to circulate online by the time Karen stormed back into the picture. Karen was in full panic mode now. She was wearing her HOA president badge on a lanyard, as if that gave her more power than a property deed, and she marched right into the yard with a rolled-up binder of HOA bylaws. She tried to declare a temporary emergency ordinance banning construction during social events but failed to realize that the moment she stepped onto my land, she'd entered a space protected by the renovation permits already filed and logged at the county office. I didn't even have to say a word. A county representative had shown up that morning with a clipboard, nodded at me, and posted 2 large red signs at the edge of the property. Active construction zone. Do not enter without PPE. Watching Karen stand there, screaming over the sound of a jackhammer while the guests whispered and filmed her with their phones, was deeply satisfying. But things weren't done spiraling. Not even close. At around 10:30, a white catering van pulled in and stopped short at the sight of the rubble. 2 chefs stepped out, confused, holding trays of hors d'oeuvres. When they tried to unload, Jake stepped in and asked them where their safety helmets were. They didn't have any. He pointed to the posted regulations and politely informed them that without the right gear, they were violating county policy. They tried to laugh it off, but Lenny backed him up with a clipboard and a waiver sheet no one could sign because no one wanted to assume the liability. The chefs left. The food never got served. And Chase finally began to understand that he wasn't just dealing with a petty neighbor. He was dealing with a man who had outmaneuvered his entire operation with blueprints, permits, and perfect timing. Amber, meanwhile, was crying on a folding chair, mascara dripping down her cheeks, as she argued on the phone with someone who clearly wasn't picking up. Probably her parents, who had yet to arrive. Her white gown was now slightly stained from the dust in the air, and her bridesmaids looked like they were minutes away from quitting altogether. One even asked if she could leave early to get to her retail shift. Amber just nodded, too drained to argue. Karen tried one last desperate tactic. She called a private security team and claimed she needed them to enforce HOA rules and remove all unauthorized personnel. 2 men in tactical-looking polos arrived, but the moment they were shown the legal property lines and the county's signed permit notices, they backtracked fast. One of them even apologized to me and said he hated working HOA gig. Karen's face turned purple. She grabbed her phone and started making calls, but her power was slipping. The HOA board had been getting flooded with angry emails from residents who'd seen the drone footage online and realized their fees had helped fund a private wedding on someone else's stolen yard. And then came the cherry on top. My friend from the local news station had gotten wind of what was happening and decided to swing by with a cameraman. Not because of the wedding, but because the footage of Karen lying to law enforcement and misusing HOA power was exactly the kind of HOA scandal their viewers ate up. The reporter, Angela, was an old college friend who had once interviewed me for a piece on sustainable home engineering. Now she stood on the sidewalk, mic in hand, interviewing wedding guests about their experience. Most tried to avoid the camera. One drunk uncle happily said I thought this was a hotel or something. They just told us to show up and not ask questions. Classic Karen. The segment aired that night and went viral within hours. By noon, the place was in total chaos. Guests began leaving. The bride's family arrived and were immediately pulled into a heated argument with Chase near the ruined gazebo. Apparently, they had paid Karen directly for the event space and were now demanding their money back. When she refused, they threatened legal action. Someone in the crowd was already on the phone with a lawyer, and someone else was tagging local authorities in an HOA watchdog Facebook group post that included pictures of the trashed lawn and Karen screaming beside a pile of construction tape. The final blow came when Denise, now covered in dust and sipping an energy drink, stood on the lawn and yelled through a megaphone that the next phase of soil compaction was beginning. She advised everyone still on the property to move unless they wanted to feel what a vibratory roller felt like from 3 feet away. That was enough to clear the area. The last few guests scattered. Karen stood frozen in place, speechless for the first time since I'd met her. She turned to Chase, who looked at her with pure contempt, and then to Amber, who was now texting furiously and likely looking for a new venue. As the machines fired back up and the yard filled with motion and noise, I stepped outside and surveyed the destruction. Not destruction in the usual sense, but justice. Legal, precise, unshakable. I had defended my home without laying a single hand on anyone. No violence, no threats. Just paperwork, planning, and the patience to outlast them all. Karen finally left in silence, retreating to her office where I knew a storm of complaints and bored resignations were waiting. Chase and Amber drove off separately, neither speaking, both humiliated beyond repair. The wedding that had been promised as a grand HOA showcase had turned into the most embarrassing social failure in neighborhood history. And as my friends packed up their gear, grinning and high-fiving one another, I raised a cup of lemonade in the air and said, to no one in particular, let that be a lesson. My land is not for rent, not for bribes, and definitely not for people who think rules are for everyone else. But it wasn't over yet. I had more planned. Because when someone like Karen gets embarrassed, she doesn't disappear. She plots. And I had a strong feeling she wasn't going to let this go quietly. Fine by me. I wasn't just ready. I was 3 steps ahead. 2 days after the demolition crew packed up and the last of the folding chairs had been dragged away by a very quiet and very embarrassed rental company, my yard still bore the scars of what had happened. The grass was torn, the soil uneven, and the air still carried the faint scent of concrete dust. But I didn't mind. Every scratch and patch of churned-up earth was a reminder that for once, the HOA didn't get to steamroll someone without consequences. I had gone to war with their entitled circus and walked away victorious. At least, that's what I thought. The first warning sign came in the form of a thin white envelope slid under my front door. No stamp, no handwriting, just my name typed in bold font and a folded paper inside. It was a formal letter from Karen herself. She claimed the HOA would be filing a grievance against me for destruction of communal space, interference with an approved community event, and violation of neighborhood peace standards. I laughed out loud. She had the nerve to call my private backyard communal space, even after her claims had been ripped apart on camera and across social media. The neighborhood knew the truth now. Karen had lied, misused HOA funds, and forged fake event approvals. And yet, she was still trying to claw her way back. I didn't waste time. I forwarded the letter to my lawyer along with a full folder of evidence. County permits, time-stamped videos, drone footage, news reports, and a copy of the deed showing my property lines. He responded the same afternoon. "Don't worry. Let her keep digging. She's about to bury herself." What I didn't know yet was that Karen was far from finished. She was pulling strings behind the scenes, trying to salvage her position before the next HOA election. She called an emergency board meeting and tried to paint me as the aggressor. Claimed I had intentionally sabotaged a wedding out of personal spite and that the construction work was all a smokescreen. But it didn't work. Residents were tired of her. Ever since the footage had gone viral, neighbors who used to stay quiet had started speaking up. One man revealed that Karen had fined him for inappropriate lawn decorations, just because his granddaughter had left a stuffed flamingo near the driveway. Another neighbor said she'd once been fined for planting vegetables instead of flowers. The more people shared, the more Karen's empire of control began to crack. Then came the moment I didn't expect. A knock at my door. Not from the HOA, not from the police, but from Amber and her father. They looked uncomfortable, but not angry. Amber's gown was long gone, replaced with jeans and a hoodie, her makeup-free face looking 10 years younger and 1,000 pounds lighter. Her father introduced himself as Glenn and offered me a sincere apology. He said they had no idea Karen didn't have legal authority to host the wedding on my land. They'd paid her thousands of dollars for the venue, thinking it was an exclusive deal arranged through the HOA. When I asked why they didn't verify anything, he sighed and admitted they'd trusted the official tone of her emails and the confidence she spoke with. She played the part well. Too well. Amber chimed in, saying she now realized how manipulated they'd been. Chase had insisted everything was handled, and Karen had promised them the world. But after the wedding collapsed and the video blew up online, she started questioning everything. She was leaving Chase, she said bluntly. He was more concerned with his live-stream statistics than her actual feelings, and the disaster had opened her eyes. I could tell she meant it. There was no bitterness in her tone. Just tired resignation. They handed me a check. Not a bribe, not hush money, but a reimbursement for the damages and inconvenience. I didn't ask for it, but I didn't refuse it either. The gesture meant something. Not every person involved in that mess had been malicious. Some were just caught in the middle of Karen's delusions. Before they left, Glenn said if I ever needed a favor in court to call him. He was a civil litigation attorney. The irony made me grin. The fallout spread faster than Karen could contain. The HOA board fractured. 2 members resigned within the week, citing stress and ethical concerns. A special audit was launched by the county after a formal complaint was filed, anonymously, though I had a good guess who might have submitted it. I sent a polite email to the county office offering to cooperate and supply all relevant documents. They replied within hours, grateful for my cooperation and already aware of the footage I'd given to the news station. Karen tried one more stunt. She hosted a neighborhood unity brunch at the clubhouse, hoping to reset the narrative. But only a handful of residents showed up, most of them elderly folks who hadn't heard the full story. The rest of the community boycotted it. Some even stood across the street with signs reading, "We want truth, not tea," and "No more dictator decor." I stayed home, enjoying the peace and watching the whole thing through binoculars from my back porch. A few nights later, I got a call from Denise. Her voice was full of amusement. She'd been contacted by a podcast that covers outrageous HOA incidents nationwide. They wanted her to talk about what had happened, maybe even do a follow-up video with Jake and Lenny. I gave them permission to use my footage, and told them to send me the link when it aired. The story was already trending on multiple platforms, but this was going to cement it into HOA folklore. Then, one quiet evening, I received an envelope from the county office. This one had an official seal and a crisp set of documents inside. It was a revised property map, issued after their review of Karen's fake annexations. It clearly marked my land as private, explicitly removed from all HOA jurisdiction, with a note clarifying that any future claims made by the HOA against this land would be considered invalid and punishable by fines. I laughed out loud. I pinned the new map above my workbench and cracked open a cold drink. That same week, Karen's legal threats stopped. Either her lawyer advised her to cut her losses, or she finally realized there was no path forward. But she didn't apologize. She didn't acknowledge any wrongdoing. Instead, she began quietly cleaning out her office. One day she was in charge, and the next, the nameplate on her door was gone. By the end of the month, the HOA board called a vote to restructure the entire leadership team. A new group was elected, more balanced, more transparent, and definitely more cautious about overstepping. They sent me a formal apology letter, offered to cover any remaining yard restoration costs, and included a handwritten note from one of the newer members that simply said, "Thank you for standing your ground. You reminded all of us what boundaries really mean." I stood in my backyard that night, looking at the soft glow of solar lights lining the fence, the rebuilt koi pond burbling quietly, and the fresh grass just beginning to grow. It had been a mess, a circus, a full-blown drama from beginning to end. But it was over. I had taken back what was mine, not through shouting or threats, but through grit, planning, and a little help from people who knew how to swing a sledgehammer. Of course, deep down, I suspected Karen wasn't entirely finished. People like her rarely go away forever. But that was fine, because I'd rebuilt stronger. And next time, I wouldn't just be ready. I'd be 10 steps ahead. The neighborhood had changed. It wasn't obvious at first, not in the way you might notice a new coat of paint or a torn-down fence, but the shift was real. You could feel it in the air. People who used to wave nervously now strolled with confidence. The usual cliques that orbited Karen's influence had disbanded like smoke. The gossip circles were gone, replaced with small, quiet gatherings where people actually laughed without checking over their shoulders. It was peace, not just in my yard but all around the block. And I had nearly forgotten what that felt like. There was no more HOA drama knocking on my door, no clipboard-bearing strangers treating my property like a park. For the first time in a long while, I could sit on my porch with a cold drink and know that my land was mine again. Not in theory, but in practice. Still, I didn't get complacent. Karen had vanished like a shadow under a floodlight, but history told me people like her didn't fade out so easily. They regrouped. They found new platforms. They waited for their chance to reclaim control. So I stayed alert. I filed every document, saved every email, and archived every recording. The evidence that once defended me had now become my shield. But weeks went by, and all I heard from Karen was silence. It was as if the woman who once barked HOA rules at joggers now no longer existed. No more fines. No more newsletters. No more condescending notes taped to community bulletin board. Just quiet. I started focusing on repairs. Lenny brought over his compact loader to smooth out the soil, and Denise helped me rebuild the stone path through the yard. We relaid the koi pond liner, replaced the gravel with polished river stones, and planted fresh shrubs to outline the new boundary line, one now marked by an elegant but unmistakable black metal fence. Jake even rigged a subtle motion sensor system that lit up soft spotlights whenever someone walked too close to the edge of the property, just for good measure. I didn't want revenge anymore. I had already won that battle. What I wanted now was prevention. No more trespassing, no more entitled parties, and definitely no more unsolicited weddings. Then came the most unexpected twist of all. One quiet Saturday morning, I found a certified letter in my mailbox. Not from the HOA or Karen, but from the county. It was an invitation, more like a request, to attend a review hearing. Not because I was in trouble, but because they were reassessing the legal structure of the neighborhood's HOA entirely. My case, along with evidence from several other complaints, had triggered a county-level investigation. They were considering revoking the HOA's charter or at minimum placing it under state oversight. And they wanted my input. I attended the meeting in a modest room inside the county administration building. It smelled like old carpet and printer ink, and the walls were lined with chairs full of people who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. But when my name was called and I stood up to speak, the mood shifted. I walked them through the events, the unapproved wedding, the fake documentation, the abuse of power and the blind eye turned by local law enforcement. I didn't yell or accuse. I just laid out facts, time-stamped, documented, and undeniable. And when I finished, I looked across the table at the county officials and said one thing. I'm not asking for revenge. I'm asking for safeguards so no one else has to go through what I did. They nodded, took notes, asked follow-ups, and promised a full review. Whether they'd follow through, I didn't know. But it was a start. A signal that someone higher up was finally listening. Word spread quickly. I didn't have to say anything. People talked. And within days, the neighborhood chat threads were flooded with speculation about the HOA's future. Some people panicked, thinking that without HOA oversight, the streets would descend into chaos. Others celebrated, relieved that Karen's rule by fear had reached its expiration date. I stayed out of it. I didn't need to lead the charge anymore. My part was done. Then, just when I was ready to move on completely, I received a thick envelope delivered by courier. No return address. No name. Just my address and a wax seal stamped on the back. Inside was a wedding invitation. White cardstock, gold trim, a delicate embossed pattern of roses. I almost laughed when I saw the names printed in bold letters. Chase and Amber. Apparently, they were giving it another shot. Not the grand circus wedding with drone footage and harp solos, but a beachside ceremony. Small, private, and hosted far from any HOA territory. The card included a handwritten note from Amber. She thanked me for being the reason she'd finally opened her eyes. Said the disaster had humbled them both and brought them closer together in the strangest way. She even offered to send back the leftover chair rental they never used. I didn't know whether to smile or shake my head. I didn't go. I sent a gift instead. A miniature jackhammer replica with the engraving "Congratulations on demolishing the past." It was my final word on the matter. A closing chapter to a story that had gone far beyond anyone's expectations. In the weeks that followed, life returned to something resembling normal. The fence remained, the grass grew back, and the koi began circling again like they'd never seen a wedding guest stomp through their pond. The new HOA board reached out to me occasionally, mostly for advice on what rules to revise or remove. I gave them my thoughts, but I kept my distance. I had fought hard for my solitude, and I wasn't about to give it up just because the leadership changed. If anything, I became the unofficial line in the sand. Proof that one person could push back and win. One afternoon, Jake and Denise came over for a barbecue. We sat in lawn chairs near the new patio, sipping cold drinks and swapping stories. Lenny rolled up late with a cooler in one hand and a box of fireworks in the other. The sky turned orange as the sun dipped behind the trees, and for a moment, the whole nightmare felt like something from a different life. They asked me what I'd do if Karen ever came back. I shrugged. Probably invite her to the demolition-themed escape room we're building in town. Let her see what real construction planning looks like. We laughed. But deep down, I knew the best revenge wasn't the rubble or the legal wins or the viral clip. It was this. Peace. Autonomy. Reclaiming something that was always mine and watching it thrive again. As the night drew to a close and the last soda cans hit the bin, I stood under the porch light and looked out over the yard. My yard. Once hijacked, now restored. And I realized something important. The HOA had tried to erase my boundaries. They'd tried to rewrite the rules and treat my property like a stage set for their delusions. But in the end, they had learned a lesson the hard way. You don't cross the line when the person on the other side built it, fortified it, and had blueprints of every inch. So I smiled, flicked off the porch light, and stepped inside. The war was over. The message had been delivered. And the next time anyone thought about scheduling a wedding without asking, they'd remember the man who responded not with anger, but with excavation permits, demolition crews, and the full force of quiet, calculated payback.